NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era 1974. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. Welcome to episode 14 of our series The Other Day 1961 to 1991, Current Era. Events, people and occurrences which defined a lifestyle. Things that we can't imagine ourselves without, let alone comprehend. Another year, another episode. This time we're covering 1974. The Baikal Amur Mainline, the Mona Lisa on display in the USSR. The Watergate scandal. Government bonds being paid off, the Red Snowball Tree, the non-black soil region reformation program, Nadia Rousheva's drawings, the 9th studio, calorie training school. Commenting we have economic expert Yegor Gaidar, writer Anatoly Strelyny, Central Committee member Foreign Affairs Minister Raoul Leroy and other officials. In 1974, a 4-series film is released titled People and Mannequins. Arkady Rykin's short films became a genre in and of themselves. Packing them inside a uniform storyline wasn't necessary, as was the case with the previous works of the Soviet Union's favorite performer. In the film, Rykin for 4.5 hours plays in sketches, sings, and sometimes just talks into the camera. This movie enriched the Russian language not just with expressions, but also with Rykin's trademark delivery. In the Greek Hall, in the Greek Hall. Who's there? If someone were to lean me against a warm wall, in a quiet place, I would very much be open to a conversation. One of the main concepts that defined the era, deficit, which left a peculiar taste in your mouth. Peculiar. Those diligent government bondholders who were still hanging on to this particular stock were finally able to receive some of their money in 1974. These loans were a way to forcibly confiscate 10 to 15% of people's earnings. The idea was that the country was borrowing money from the people and would repay them in no time. These admittedly nice-looking bonds, depicting factories, mines, and fields, were shoved down people's throats up until 1958, when they finally abandoned the loans and at the same time postponed reimbursement. So back then, most people figured that the delay was indefinite. Then a new generation came along, and in the early 70s, little kids would use 1940s-era bonds as play money. But at this point, they decided to return 1 billion out of the 25 they owed. An old 100-ruble bond was now worth 10, with 0 interest after 30 years had gone by. The Russian Society for Protecting Historical and Cultural Monuments comes up with the idea to connect ancient Midland Russian towns into a circle. Architectural masterpieces were given a refresh, and in 1974, the first tour guide around the Golden Ring is published. That very same year, Suzdal, the town richest in attractions, was celebrating its 950th birthday. It received an Order of the Badge of Honor for, quote, propagating the cultural heritage and preserving masterpieces of ancient Russian arts and promoting mass tourism, end quote. Russia's Golden Ring consisted of 12 towns: Pereslavl, Rostov, Uglich, Yaroslavl, Kostroma, Plios, Suzdal, Vladimir, Yuryev-Polsky, Alexandrov, plus 2 that had been renamed: Zagorsk, formerly known as Sergiev Posad, and Tutayev, formerly Romanov-Borisoglepsk. To drive the entire route, which exceeded 600 miles in length, an entire month was required. There were loads of red Icarus and striped Laz buses roaming that long ring road. All of these postcard-worthy Russian towns were appreciated both in the country and abroad. They hastily put up hotels, campsites, and restaurants. Meanwhile, in Suzdal and Rostov, they were building tourist complexes of unprecedented magnitude by regional center standards. The restoration and preservation of historical monuments becomes a state priority. All war against churches ceased, with them now being akin to museums. Meanwhile, in the US, the Watergate scandal was gaining momentum. Back in the fall of 1972, members of President Nixon's campaign staff were caught trying to wiretap the headquarters of the competing Democratic Party in the Watergate Hotel in Washington. Nixon was elected for a second term, but the scandal wouldn't blow over. Furthermore, people learn about Nixon's attempts to interfere with the investigation. The Soviet press, which typically relishes in these kinds of dirty politics, stays silent this time, due to the fact that Nixon and Brezhnev exchanged visits on a yearly basis. Soviet journalists would write about extensive Soviet-US cooperation. This went on for almost 2 years, and only when the situation in Washington was nearing its culmination, that's when our people were finally told about Watergate. On the 6th of August, Soviet papers published a message with no additional commentary, which seemed a bit strange. It spoke of Vice President Gerald Ford insisting on Nixon's innocence, proposing disapproval instead of impeachment, which was a word that a Russian person couldn't really even pronounce. On August 8th, our news outlets report on upcoming discussions about the impeachment in Congress. Then they inform us about Nixon's meetings with certain senators and congressmen, with Ford, and later with the heads of both houses. Then on the 10th, out of nowhere, we hear about Nixon's resignation, which coincided with Ford's oath and him completely and unconditionally pardoning former President Nixon. Aside from the relationship that it formed with Nixon, there was another reason to stay silent on the matter. Watergate was a clear indication of the might of America's political system. Those in power attempt to use their advantageous position against the competition, and were forced to pay the ultimate price in the form of resignation. When our papers finally wrote about Watergate, more than a few people got the wrong idea. The Watergate scandal, which they had been dragging out for quite some time, unfolded before the Soviet people in just 5 days. TASS issued its first message on August 6th, and on August 11th, the last message was released on newly appointed President Ford meeting with our temporary envoy Vorontsov to confirm the continuity of United States policy in regards to the USSR. Life in the city was becoming more and more convenient. However, the old 127-volt power grid was no longer able to keep up. The Council of Ministers issued a decree in 1974 which increased the Soviet household power system's standard voltage to 220 volts. Housing built according to the latest projects came equipped with electric stoves instead of gas cookers. The USSR reaches world-class levels when it came to widespread use of the main 3 electric appliances. In 1974, the amount of TV sets per 100 families was 71, washing machines 62, refrigerators 55. There was some availability on the free market, but it was hard to find new standard-compliant items. Out of the 50 television sets in production, only 4 were color. Large fridges with over 26 gallons of internal volume and semi-automatic washing machines were also rare. In the year 1974, Soviet visual arts are irreversibly divided into good and bad, official and underground, realistic and progressive. The symbols of that dichotomy were the manege and bulldozer exhibitions, reporting to the masses. That's how they described artwork exhibits made by 165 members of the Soviet Academy of Arts on display at the Manege's Central Exhibition Hall. Their artistic method was called socialist realism. Even old Russian landscape painting traditions were enriched with ideas. At the same time, 27 progressive artists decide to hold their own show on an empty lot on the outskirts of Moscow, in the Belyaevo district, which they informed most Soviet and foreign journalists about beforehand. Authorities tried to convince the artists to stay at home, but reasoning with them didn't work. And so, on the day of the premiere, 3 bulldozers appeared at the scene. By then, issuing messages about alleged hooligans who were interfering with Sunday cleaning wasn't enough to silence the hype in foreign press. So in 10 days, 88 alternative artists were allowed to put their work on display for a few hours in Moscow's Izmailova Park. The existence of unrecognized art could no longer be ignored. A small girl sticks a red carnation into the muzzle of a machine gun. In the spring of 1974, this photo was featured in newspapers all around the world. A non-violent revolution was underway in Portugal, during which the military forced Prime Minister Caetano to step down. The revolution was over in no time. Army units were fast to join the rebels, who turned out to be mid-level officers. They called themselves the Movement of Captains, and they weren't intent on imposing a military dictatorship. Portugal's path towards developing democratic institutions wasn't of much interest in our parts. On the other hand, the demise of the Portuguese colonial empire was of much greater importance. Cape Verde received independence, together with Guinea-Bissau, as well as Angola and Mozambique, which were in the process of establishing tight relations with the USSR. The last two were now headed by believers in Marxism. Now Angola and Mozambique were officially declared people's republics. On February 14, 1974, TASS informs the nation that, according to a decree issued by the Supreme Soviet Presidium, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Soviet citizenship was declared void, with him being evicted from Soviet territory on February 13th. Prior to this, the papers wrote about a book called The Gulag Archipelago, which had been recently published in the West. Most of the people were oblivious to the true meaning of this acronym. Writers called this book slanderous and decided to counter this so-called Vlasov literature. It later became known that Solzhenitsyn had flown into West Germany. Thanks to caricatures published in Crocodile magazine, people were able to find out that Solzhenitsyn had a beard. The very next day after Solzhenitsyn was deported, the papers published reactions from working folk, in the vein of "weeds have no place on a field" or "good riddance." Here's a pretty typical opinion. When my family heard TASS's message on Solzhenitsyn's Soviet citizenship having been revoked, honestly, I just felt so relieved. In 1974, the country first hears a rather resonant acronym, BUM. The idea to build another railroad through Siberia all the way to the Far East first came about before World War II even. Discussions resumed due to relations with China deteriorating. Meanwhile, the Trans-Sib, which was built during the time of the Russian Empire, was just too close to the border with China. Another reason was the need to move towards the east, closer to the crude oil, natural gas, timber, and precious metals. Ust-Kut is where the Big Bam began, the only settlement with 3 names. We're in the town of Ust-Kut, over there is the Lena station, and on the Lena River is Port Osetrovo. The Bam was off to a vigorous start. It wasn't even mentioned in the 5-year plan. It was first mentioned by Brezhnev in March. In April it was declared a shock construction project. The slogan "Bam or Bust" was uttered during a Komsomol Congress. And soon the first construction brigade, consisting of 600 Komsomol members, was dispatched from Moscow. In the public's mind, the Baikal-Amur mainline was seriously discredited due to rumors of prison labor being used to advance the shock construction project. A saying of the day went like, "Conman is what you call a Komsomol member beyond the Baikal." They expected the Baikal-Amur mainline to become profitable after 10 years, since a good 10 industrial complexes were meant to emerge alongside it. But the only thing established was the near Yungri coal mine, so there was really nothing to transport using the BAM. The Baikal-Amur mainline construction project is a pretty typical example of a socialist construction of the century type deal. This was an expensive and large-scale project. It had an air of romanticism to it with all of that beautiful Siberian scenery. It had full support from the Soviet propaganda machine. But from an economic standpoint, it was completely pointless. We knew how to build roads. That's way easier than producing competitive goods and quality consumer products. The problem is that it never occurred to anybody to ask a simple question. Why are we even building this railroad? What exactly do we intend to transport, and in which direction? The project wound up costing 4 times more than estimated, and it was never even completely brought to fruition. Even today, the cost of railroad transportation takes into account the expenses which are meant to offset the losses that are directly linked to a railroad that was never fully put into service. Initially, they declared that the Baikal-Amur mainline would be complete by 1983. Then the deadline was moved to 1986, then to 1989. The bomb was being built even slower than the old Trans-Siberian Railroad, and it turned out to be more expensive. So today, the last of the fruit flies perished. The ritual of greeting honored guests is cemented. These include leaders of socialist countries, of third world nations that had close relations with the USSR, and the most prominent Western countries. When any of them arrived with an official visit, they were always taken for a ride on Leninsky Prospect, with a string of Muscovites standing on the side of the road waving 2 nations' flags. The prospect was blocked off for regular motorists. Waving from every flagpole, you had 2 national flags. Plus, you'd see a smattering of banners placed next to the road, which would read something about reinforcing friendship or broadening cooperation. Alongside the long highway, you had thousands of school kids, college students, academic institute employees, workers from the Red Proletarian and Ordzhonikidze factories, all standing in specially designated areas. First, a couple of Volgas would blow past them, and then government limousines would appear with a motorcycle escort. During the summer, the first of those limos, which had an open top, would be transporting Brezhnev and the VIP guest, who would be waving to the crowd. But during the winter, it was impossible to see who exactly was being greeted. The tall blonde man with 1 black shoe hits Soviet movie theaters. Our favorite Frenchmen, the buck-toothed Fernandel, Tiny de Funès, and Superman Belmondo, are complemented by Foolish Jean, aka Pierre Richard. The tall blonde dude's profession sounded like a special agent's call sign, Fiddler. Somewhere nearby, a few real agents were operating, and as a result, the simple guy kept getting tangled in one exploit after another. He's a strong one. This action film parody was complemented by some pretty bold by 1970s standards erotic scenes. I'll leave soon. The tall blonde man makes it to the top of the Soviet adult film charts. This movie's R-equivalent rating, which is a rare thing in the comedy genre, was earned thanks to Richard's partner, the seductive Mireille Darc. The Lazdynai district in Vilnius was a fine example of housing construction. There, instead of separate buildings, they put up micro-districts. For implementing this new revolutionary approach, a group of Lithuanian architects and engineers receive a Lenin Prize in 1974. Buildings in Lazdynai were arranged in groups. Depending on the landscape, they'd have anywhere from 5 to 12 floors. Together with housing, they put up schools, kindergartens, shopping malls, polyclinics, a restaurant, and a movie theater. The humaneness of this micro-district in Vilnius confirms the notion that life in the Baltic states was almost like in the West. The group of Lithuanian architects and builders who created Lazdynai were awarded the Lenin Prize for 1974. On June 18, 1974, the country's most famous military commander passes away. The one and only 4-time hero of the Soviet Union, Marshal Zhukov. The Soviet Union's Suvorov, who coordinated forces on basically every vital battle line, who accepted Germany's surrender and saw the victory parade with his own eyes. He was buried with all the honors. After the war, Zhukov first faded into the background and then later rose to the rank of defense minister and Politburo member, only to then be unceremoniously shut down by Khrushchev for quote-unquote Bonapartism. Up until Khrushchev himself was forced to step down, Zhukov was living in hopeless disgrace. However, his roller coaster of a career didn't change how the elder generation regarded Marshal Zhukov. As for the younger generation, in their eyes, Zhukov made a comeback still in his lifetime. While portrayed by Mikhail Ulyanov in the movie Liberation, the Marshal's memories and reflections were considered to be the definitive wartime memoirs. In 1974, Cyprus was going through a time of discord. The island's president, Archbishop Makarios, who was pretty well known in our parts, was forced into temporary exile. In July, the National Guard acted against Makarios, with it consisting of Cyprian Greeks just like him. Makarios flees to London, and meanwhile on the island, Turkey's military retaliates, allegedly in the name of defending the Cyprian Turks. Then Greece declares general mobilization and sends in paratroopers. The UN assists in working out a peace agreement. However, Cyprus was now divided into two regions, Turkish and Greek. In December, President Makarios returns to the island and resumes work as head of state, after becoming more famous all around the world, and especially in the USSR, where Archbishop Makarios was the only Orthodox priest who routinely appeared on television. In 1974, the Soviet Union's first supertanker was launched, named Crimea. The amount of crude oil it could carry was enough to fill a 25-mile-long train. The Crimea supertanker became the first ship created under the program for building gigantic oil haulers. It displaced 180,000 tons of water, and meanwhile a 300,000-ton displacement ship was in the works. New deposits were being developed in Siberia, with crude oil export being the primary means of acquiring hard foreign currency. The various technological innovations that went into the Crimea supertanker rule out any possible contamination of the sea. In 1974, the film The Red Snowball Tree hits Soviet theaters, based on a screenplay by Vasily Shukshin, who also directed the movie and starred in the lead role. The film falls under the category Russian People's Choice. For the first time in the land of great cinema, with its utterly merciless criminal code, a movie focuses on a repeat offending thief who wants to lead a normal life after serving his sentence. And now, the choir of former repeat offenders will perform a contemplative song called Evening Ring. The band can be joined by those who are nearing the end of their sentence and are soon to be released from prison. After serving his sentence, Yegor Prakudin, nicknamed Grief, finds his pen pal who was from the same town as him and moves in with her. She was played by Shukshin's actual wife, actress Lydia Fedoseyeva. But then Yegor starts getting harassed by his former buddies who were upset that he abandoned them. Back up. Shoot him! Jump! Even before it came out, the movie was accused of having a hopeless tone and of glorifying a thief. What's the matter with you? Yegor! Yegor, darling! That was my mother, However, the criticism was drowned in the untypically unanimous acclaim from viewers. At the All-Union Film Festival in Baku, The Red Snowball Tree was awarded first prize. It was declared Movie of the Year. Aw, baby, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Want to sing a song? I'm not up for songs. Oh, come on. I know a really good one. The Red Snowball Tree. I know that song. Go ahead and sing along with me then. It's nice and ripe. For the love of God, Yegor, tell me that they're not going to hurt you. In October of the same year, while at the peak of his glory, Writer, director, and actor Vasily Shukshin unexpectedly dies from a heart attack during the filming of Sergei Bondarchuk's movie They Fought for Their Country. Shukshin's family received thousands of letters with people expressing their condolences. In the summer of 1974, at the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, an exhibition took place featuring one single portrait, the Mona Lisa or La Joconde, by Leonardo da Vinci. This was the first time the world's most well-known painting was on display in our parts. For an entire month, there was a line in front of the Fine Arts Museum. People even came from other cities to see the Mona Lisa. Journals published color and black and white copies. Newspapers featured feedback from those who saw the masterpiece, as well as explanations for the portrait's main mystery. By playing with light and shadow, Leonardo outlined a way to transition from a subtle smile to a serious face to an even bigger smile. Meat and butter had all but disappeared from provincial stores. Their concentration in meat and dairy products also diminished. Soy flour was added to sausage, with its proportion over time gradually increasing to 30%. This sort of sausage would start flaking when cut to pieces. It barely had any aroma, and domesticated dogs and cats would tend to stay away from it. Butter became available in light varieties. First came country, then the even lighter sandwich, which was an even less buttery type of butter, against the classic meaning of the expression. Sandwich butter applied onto a piece of bread would actually release water droplets. Real milk could only be found at children's dairy kitchens. Meanwhile, in stores, you'd only see normalized milk, or in other words, diluted to specification, or even protein. You didn't even have to wash the empty bottles. Just rinsing them was enough. The book on tasty and healthy food, which was published in vast quantities during the time of Stalin, turns into dissident and outright criminal literature. This was now the only way you could find out that there existed carbonade, Savoy, and Tambov ham. Legends emerged about times when caviar just sat and nobody wanted to buy it. Smoked meat becomes a fetish, together with red and white fish, canned crab and cod liver. Until the very end of this era, various canned foods in conjunction with Armenian cognac, chocolates containing liquor, and imported instant coffee would be considered Soviet symbols of gastronomic excess. 1974 was the year of national solidarity with Chilean patriots. At first, in the wake of the September revolt of the previous year, the protests against evil doings weren't personified, but now the main heroes were Bard Victor Jara, who was executed in the very beginning, and General Secretary of the Chilean Communist Party, Luis Corvalán, who was stuck in a concentration camp. Luis Corvalán turned 60 in 1974, and right before his birthday, a campaign to free the leader of Chile's communists begins to gain momentum. But to no avail. Corvalán and 240 more prisoners remained locked up in a camp located on the remote Dawson Island in the Pacific Ocean. Aside from the USSR, solidarity was expressed by the people of East Germany, where there were plenty of Chilean immigrants, and of Bulgaria, where Corvalán's son decided to settle. A bunch of documentaries were filmed. A typical name sounded like Chile, the Time of Struggle and Unrest, or His Name is Lucho, which was Corvalán's nickname within the Communist Party. Freedom to the patriots of Chile. Victor Jara was a bard and songwriter who would perform his own music. One of his ballads was called The Wind of Change. Jara was one of the leaders of the Communist Party youth organization. We put it a bit more plainly. He was a member of the Chilean Komsomol Central Committee. These camera images will undoubtedly be included in the indictment. After all, the camera lens shows an unbiased picture. We first learn about the Nacional Stadium, which was turned into a torture chamber, immediately after the coup. In the fall of 1973, when our country refused to send our national soccer team over here to square off with the Chilean squad, that's when they declared our loss. Right here at Chile's main sports arena is where Victor Jara was murdered. According to witnesses, before they executed the bard, they broke both his hands with a rifle stock. Among the songs of 1974 that Central Television broadcast was one performed by Belarusian pop star Viktor Vujicic, which went, "They murdered music alongside the guitar, but don't mourn the song that they shot dead. In your suffering, Chile, create a new song, but do not mourn the song that they shot dead." There were plenty of amateur political song ensembles, some of them being comprised of Chilean students who decided to stay in the USSR. These ensembles were often called Venceremos and Grenada, in keeping with the tradition of our solidarity with Spanish-speaking nations. These ensembles sang songs of protest from a continent in flames, which is what they'd traditionally call Latin America. The most well-known melody sounded like El pueblo unido jamás será vencido, which translates to "While we stand united, we will never be defeated." A play by Henryk Borovic was shown in Soviet theaters called Interview in Buenos Aires, about a Chilean immigrant in the capital of Argentina. In its Leningrad iteration, El Pueblo Unido was sung by Alisa Freundlich and Mikhail Boyarsky. In 1974, Soviet pop culture was joined by a Calorie School student. This character immediately brought fame upon impersonator Gennady Khazanov. I often get asked, why did I go to Calorie School? This Soviet pop culture little guy was conceived by Arkady Arkhanov and Leon Izmailov. During an exam, the student was asked, "What's missing in this soup?" To which he responds, "Bread." This loser attending the Calorie School goes on to star in TV holiday specials throughout all of 1974. He also told stories about how he loaded up on watermelon and escorted a girl to her place, too shy to tell her that he needed to go to the bathroom. That same year, Khazanov wins a prize at an all-union contest for pop artists. They flunked me. I almost got expelled from school. However, the leaders of two superpowers agreed on the need for initiating a dialogue. In July of 1974, a tombstone was placed on Nikita Khrushchev's grave at the Novodevichy cemetery made by sculptor Ernst Neizvestny. This was the first monument to a former head of state that was put up by a private party. Blocks from white and black marble, and in between, the head of Mr. Khrushchev. This monument becomes the most famous tombstone at the country's primary cemetery, which was soon no longer openly accessible to the general public. The relatives of those who were buried there received permits. Hockey was our country's sport number one, and a new generation of hockey players was being brought up all around the country, except for maybe the South Caucasus and Middle Asia. The Golden Puck all-union youth hockey tournament was in its 10th season, with Almetyevsk in Tatarstan being one of the host cities. This autonomous republic was home to 27,000 young hockey players. The Golden Puck's chairman was renowned coach Anatoly Tarasov. Golden Puck's series of tournaments existed alongside athletic schools belonging to the main hockey teams. Soviet hockey was doing its very best to recruit as many talented young boys as possible. Golden Puck alumni include the Solodukhin brothers, the Golikov brothers, Sergei Kapustin, Alexander Maltsev, Nikolai Drozdetsky, Igor Larionov, Vladimir Mishkin. The best bombardier of the 1974 tournament turned out to be a boy named Andy Khomutov. Moscow's central subway stations never ceased to amaze tourists, both from Russian provinces and abroad. But new stations were being built to a different spec. The 70s were all about the ongoing spread of a modest subway. Simple cladding, more often consisting of ordinary tile instead of marble, and columns meant solely to hold up arches, instead of also serving as a decorative element. Meanwhile, in Leningrad, they were building stations with platforms that had sliding elevator-like doors. The vestibules above ground were built to price, with the letter M now potentially hanging over something that looked like an ordinary underground crosswalk. You'd go down and find yourself in an underground hall. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev bestows a gold star medal upon Tatar Zhukov. The appearance of a show called The Ninth Studio on Central Television in 1974 marked the completion of the very most prestigious system of journalism, namely international. You had your energetic traveling international reporters, who would make news stories about the West, while the Ninth Studio was where the Moscow-based analysts would come together. These included directors of institutes, Central Committee senior officials, and political commentators. They'd all work under the show's host, state television radio political commentator Valentin Zorin. The most frequent guest was director of the Institute for U.S. and Canadian Studies, Georgy Arbatov. Discussions on international affairs weren't particularly lively. This was a program aimed at serious viewers, those who were used to taking responsibility for everything. A big article was published in Komsomolskaya Pravda on drawings by a schoolgirl named Nadia Rousheva, which garnered plenty of feedback. Her work was on display at exhibitions all over the country, though she had already been gone for 5 years at that point. Nadia Rousheva became the country's #1 child prodigy in art. She began drawing at 5 years of age. Exhibitions in her name were first put together when she was 12, and by the time she suffered a stroke and passed away at 17, she had already created over 11,000 drawings. These drawings would now be put on display according to the series under which Nadia used to group her work: War and Peace, The Little Prince, The Master and Margarita, with her most well-known series being dedicated to Pushkin. Biographical books dedicated to this poet would be published with illustrations by both Pushkin himself and Rousheva. In 1974, Russia's Midlands, which included 29 autonomies and provinces with lackluster farming output figures, received the designation non-black soil area of the RSR, or non-Chernozem for short. These regions became the focus of attention due to plans for intensification. There was no point in developing remote new territories when regions located closer to home weren't generating enough profit. The decree on the non-black soil regions was being passed just 1 week after celebrating 20 years since the start of developing the Virgin Lands. The main calling of the 1970s era Komsomol went like, "The non-black soil regions are your Virgin Lands." Aside from resolving production issues, a goal was set to apply comprehensive reforms. After development, the ancestral land, just like the untouched virgin soils, was meant to become the stage for a new life, with housing, roads, schools, clubs, hospitals. In the next 5 years, the non-Chernozem regions were supposed to receive more money than they did during the previous 15. This colossal investment wasn't squandered or even embezzled. Instead, the money just disappeared without a trace. Publicists would love bringing up stories such as when a young woman left the village and would never come back to help her elderly mother. And that was the story of all Russian urbanites, who had forgotten that originally they came from the village, but perhaps it was time for them to repay the homestead, stimulated to produce an even healthier share of fresh milk, robust potatoes, and delicious pies. Reviving the non-black soil regions also meant reviving the Russian spirit, when you'd have to let go of the superficial stuff in order to get back in touch with your true self.
Родился в России, в краю полевом лесном. У нас в каждой песне береза, березка под каждым окном.
They spoke of developing the non-black soil regions in such a manner that was never used when describing any of the great initiatives in regards to building communism. They'd emphasize the fact that these were Russian lands, Russian non-black soil regions. The implication was that the time had come to finally take care of Russia, instead of constantly tending to the distant reaches, such as Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. These were dangerous talks. There was a good reason why Stalin would send people to the Kolyma for indulging in these discussions. And there were actually people from Brezhnev's circle who understood full well how volatile these discussions were. However, they were powerless to do anything at that point. Towards the end of Gorbachev's term, we began hearing how Russia needed its own Academy of Sciences, since Kyrgyzstan had one of its own, Russia needing its own Communist Party, what with there being a separate one in Turkmenistan. These talks were effectively drawing Russia from out of the country. This was an obvious move towards Russia separating from the country. Naturally, Russian patriots would never agree if you told them that they played a greater role in dismantling the USSR than, for example, the Baltic states. Vocal instrument ensembles were flourishing in the Soviet music scene. They were reminiscent of the lyrical Western rock, but would lean towards simple arrangement and uplifting lyrics. We'd call this VIA music, with the Soviet VIA movement being led by Pavel Slobodkin's Jolly Fellas, Yuri Malakov's Samotsvety, and Stas Namin's Tsvety, Flowers. Every Philharmonic society had its own vocal instrumental ensemble, as did a bunch of clubs and schools. A typical band included a solo and bass guitarist, keyboard, percussion, sometimes even saxophones and trombones. Repertoires would typically be approved by management types, but there wasn't really much demand for every song to be about politics and public life. Crowds actually preferred love songs. VIA concerts, whether recorded or live, would accompany all sorts of dance parties. The crowd would alternate between fast and slow dances. Fast dances were similar to twist or shake, while slow dances were more like waltz or tango. All other varieties were abolished. We've just finished covering 1974 in our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, current era. The next episode is going to be about 1975. Soyuz Apollo, Fortified Wine, Karpov's championship win, the Hamerovsky Center, Harlequin, Pugachev's rebellion begins on stage, Sauri in oil, the Helsinki Accords, socialism in Cambodia and Laos, Dynamo Kiev wins the most prestigious trophy, Tarkovsky's film Mirror, stamps in commerce, the song Victory Day. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.